Chapter 7. Mistake. Something was different about the Moonbeam girl, and Valyn could not bring herself to ask about the cause. The day was sweltering, beads of sweat soaking the back of Valyn's neck as she walked just behind Asta. The way to the lake was filled with soft chattering from the girl, but the words did not fully reach Valyn. When Asta had knocked at her door that afternoon, there was a smile painted upon her lips, but a weariness clouded her eyes, and there were dark circles beneath them. Her clothing should have been lighter to stave off the heat, but she wore her usual layers, not even bothering to roll up her sleeves. Valyn noticed that the strap of her bag had been sewn together recently, as it had a new stitch that she had never seen before. The air about her was strange, and Valyn felt an unease in her bones. Despite this, Asta was adamant about their lake outing, and Valyn would be the last person to deny her now. The fact that she would give Asta anything she wanted if she simply asked was a development that made her feel weak and giddy at the same time. As the two neared the water, Valyn realized with a start that Asta had asked her a question. "What?" she asked. Asta rolled her eyes playfully, putting her hands on her hips. Someone was clearly riveted by my words. Normally, Valyn was rather captivated by anything Asta did, but her concern had overrun her thoughts, and she did not know how to bring it up. Should she? Being around others was difficult, a game Valyn hadn't learned the rules for. "Anyways," Asta said, "I had asked if you had a silly dream that may one day come true." Valyn shrugged. "I have not given it much thought." The girl chuckled and shook her head. "What am I to do with you, Valyn?" Valyn shrugged again. "Well," Asta began, looking off into the forest with wistful eyes. "Ever since I was young, I dreamt of going to a ball. The gowns would be lovelier than any flower and more grand than any gold. The music would feel like happiness of the highest order, and the dancing would be as graceful as any shooting star." Valyn could never imagine herself at an event like that, but Asta would no doubt rival any dress and any gold. She looked back to Valyn, waving her hand dismissively. "A silly dream indeed, wouldn't you say?" Valyn did not agree, for anything Asta wanted could never be so inconsequential. She knew she could not say what was on her mind, so instead she said, "Perhaps one day." Asta blinked in surprise, but smiled in a way that tugged at Valyn's chest in sadness. She did not respond to Valyn. Instead, she knelt down with one knee on the ground and untied her boot, then switched legs and undid the other, tossing her shoes aside. Savoring the sunlight, she stretched her arms high in the air. While she did all this, Valyn could not look away. "Come along," Asta called as she walked to the edge of the lake, dipping her toes with a sigh. "Truly a perfect day for it, what with the sun attempting to set me ablaze." As Asta began to walk into the water, she did so with all her clothing on, not even reaching to hike up her skirt. "Your clothes," Valyn said weakly, not sure why she was so worried about them to begin with. Asta laughed as she responded, "Wet clothes are the least of life's problems." And what were Asta's problems? If only Valyn knew. She decided then to follow, if only to keep a closer eye on her. So she removed her own boots, tossed them with Asta's, and rolled her pants up to her knees, and made her way over. The water was pleasantly cool, staving off a bit of the heat, and Valyn took a cupped hand to splash some water on her neck. She kept watching Asta as she fished around, a look of concentration knitting her brows. "What are you doing?" Valyn inquired. Asta grinned up at her, pulling out a palm-sized stone the color of a stormy sky. "Looking for stones. You can find true treasures hidden in places others don't dare tread." If that was what Asta wanted, Valyn would not object, though she found it odd nonetheless. What use were stones other than to be thrown from slings? Even as she thought it, Valyn's hand went to the dagger at her thigh, and she thumbed the crystal tied to it. Perhaps it wasn't as strange as she believed. Valyn began to shove her hands into the mud as well, her fingers searching for any stones she could feel. Each one she pulled out was dull, colors varying from gray to brown to black. It seemed Asta had no better luck, as every time she found one, she grunted in dismay and threw it back into the water. They stayed like that for some time, traversing the lake only as deep as would cover their legs, exchanging some words here and there while the sounds of the forest accompanied them like music. Even as the sun began to sink farther towards the horizon, they had nothing to show for their efforts. After a long bit of silence, Asta sighed deeply, tipping her head upwards and closing her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but shut it instead, staying in her position while the daylight illuminated her dark hair and white skin like a star come to earth. Valyn felt a welling in her chest that nearly caused her to reach out, to go to her, to hold her. Though it was her deepest desire at that moment, she did not want to ruin Asta's peacefulness, so instead she did something reckless. Asta was so beautiful and sad that day. Valyn wished only to lift her spirits, and impulsiveness overruled her logic. So, with her back turned, she dove her hands down by her feet, dug out a coin-sized stone, and closed her fist around it. She willed the magic in her fist to do as she bid, and she hoped it would happen fast. The radiant golden tendrils encircled her closed hand, alighting the water as though a lamp had been lit in its darkness. As the magic pulsed within her, so too did the voices. "A stone for a bird," they said. "As an arrow to a deer, as an eclipse to the moon. Make it so, make it so." Faster. The magic needed to be faster, and so Valyn pushed it harder. The gold grew until it snaked up her arms, the sparkling of it deceptively lovely. "More," they hissed, the sound similar to the cackling of a crow, deafening in her mind. "Hungry, starving. Consume her, be fed, be full." "Valyn?" And the voices stopped, sliding away like smoke from a window, quieting slowly as the golden tendrils dulled to nothing. Valyn opened her hand, and there sat a navy stone, sparkling blue covering every inch like 1,000 diamonds. It was the single most beautiful item Valyn had ever seen, and yet she still felt it was not worthy enough. When she turned to Asta and lifted her gaze, she was not sure what she saw. Asta was there, and she was as still as the tree trunks surrounding them, but instead of roots grounding her, Valyn saw it was fear. Her eyes were wide, lips slightly open, and hands white-knuckled upon the strap of her bag. Valyn could not make sense of it, could not understand what had paralyzed the girl. She held out her hand, the stone shimmering in the fading light of the sky. "For you," Valyn said. Asta did not move. Her eyes darted to the stone, then back to Valyn. Valyn took a step forward, and Asta took one back in kind. They looked at each other again, Asta with the same wide-eyed horror, and Valyn could not begin to imagine what her own face looked like. Inside, she felt pain. It was a pain she had only felt once before, years ago, in the crumbling remains of a place she had once called home. Devastation, she realized. As she did, the telltale sign of her magic began to swell in her chest. It was a sour feeling, as if acid were coursing through her blood. But she did not want the golden light to give her away, to make her lose control as she had when she was a child. The voices rose, and she tried to ignore them and their pleas. She was no longer a child. She would not let the magic rule her. Before the magic rose too high to quell, Valyn watched as Asta reached a shaking arm out. Her delicate fingers gently took the stone from Valyn's hand and clenched it in her fist. She drew her arm back, slowly, carefully, as though Valyn may explode at any moment. Asta placed it in her bag, her eyes never leaving Valyn. "Thank you," she said, voice hoarse and weak. The magic and madness quieted once more, and Valyn took several deep breaths, drawing in as much air as she could. She wanted to collapse onto the ground, but the two were still standing in the lake, and she was unsure if moving first would frighten Asta, so she stayed. After a long while, Asta's legs slid cautiously to her side, towards dry land, and Valyn gave her a simple nod. As the girl moved away, she did so at a measured pace, keeping her gaze on Valyn as she retreated. Valyn just watched right back, a horrible feeling trickling through her. Once Asta reached the grassy lake edge, she retrieved her boots, slipped them on, and stood still for a time. It was as though she were trying to make a decision, and she could not come to a conclusion. Valyn felt sick. "Asta," Valyn called, finding that her voice was scratchy and very near tears. The girl winced as though she had been hit. "Asta," Valyn called again, a bit louder, a bit more desperate. Again, she recoiled, but her feet began to move in the opposite direction. "Please," Valyn begged, but the word was too soft for Asta to have heard. Then, Asta turned around and began to walk away. Valyn knew she had made a mistake that she could hardly have known the consequences of. She felt like she knew nothing, that her logic had fled simply because she had been overrun by one moment of wanting to please the girl she loved, and yet the action instead had driven her away. It was maddening in a way that made her chest ache with self-loathing. Would the magic never cease to take from her? Perhaps that was her fate, to live with power enough for a god, while she still had nothing at all.